Hello, everyone. I'm Karl Gerth. I teach modern Chinese history at the University of California at San Diego. Many thanks to Oscar Sanchez-Siboni for inviting me to participate in this conference today. I want to suggest today why I think we should reevaluate our use of the term socialism to describe post-1949 China, the Soviet Union, and any other country that calls itself socialist. I'll do three things with my time today. First, I'll contrast the way we use the term socialism and capitalism. Second, I'll discuss how I interpret consumerism as the demand side of industrial capitalist production. Last, I'll discuss 5 reasons why I prefer to expand the concept of capitalism to fit my evidence rather than cram all of my contradictory evidence into a socialist interpretation of the era in China after 1949. We usually think of the history of China since the Communist Revolution in 1949 as what? As an attempt by Chairman Mao Zedong, China's leader until his death in 1976, and the Chinese Communist Party to, in their words, build socialism. There are variations within this standard interpretation of China trying to build socialism. Some people see the history as a noble experiment, others see it as a giant failure, and perhaps even the justification for why we shouldn't try to replace capitalism right down to the present. At the core of all of these variations, the standard interpretation is that Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were doing something radically different than the capitalist world. Sometimes scholars acknowledge that socialism isn't a perfect fit. They add qualifications such as state socialism or actually existing socialism. But more often, especially among historians, they drop those qualifications or don't use them to begin with. As evidence of this practice, I'll point to the title of this conference. Global Capitalism and the Worlds of Socialism doesn't have the same ring if we had called it Global Capitalism and the Worlds of Actually Existing Socialism. In the view held by the Chinese state and its enemies as broad, as well as so many scholars today then, China was building socialism on its way to communism. Countless documentaries, research monographs, and textbooks reinforce this standard definition or standard interpretation of China since 1949. Here's my alternative. I think we should interpret the history of China since 1949 through the development of state-dominated varieties of capitalism, not as an effort to build socialism. I'll elaborate a bit here. Since 1949, the Communist Party of China, the CCP, has adjusted its institutional arrangements to expand capitalism. So more or less use of markets, or more or less state planning, or more or less private ownership of capital does not make China or any of these other countries socialist or capitalist, nor does more or less state control over individual consumer decisions, the focus that I have for this period. Sometimes the state exercised more control over what people sought to acquire. Other times the state was less involved. Markets, state planning, public versus private ownership, and state interference in consumerism are, in my interpretation, merely institutional arrangements that are adjusted to serve an expanding capitalism. To account for the countless combinations of institutions, I see all forms of industrial capitalism in China and elsewhere as moving points on a spectrum of state to private control over industrial capitalism from, at one extreme, a capitalism with complete state domination to, at the other extreme, a completely market-mediated capitalism. Neither of these extremes ever existed in history. I know questioning how we use the basic concepts such as capitalism and socialism may make some uncomfortable, but I think the rewards greatly outweigh a bit of initial discomfort. The title of my book here makes my argument explicit. Unending Capitalism. The Communist Revolution aimed to end capitalism, but it rather expanded it. The policies of the Communist Party were continually destroying or negating its communist revolution, even on its own terms. In my book, I make the case not by arguing about concepts, Not that my preferred use of a concept is the truer reading of Marx or Bakunin, for instance. Rather, in my book, I try to make the case through ordinary life, specifically the spread of consumerism and the implications of that spread since 1949. I recognize that it's customary to discuss capitalism primarily through production and not through what I see as the management of capitalism's demand side in consumerism. But in my view, the organization of production and consumption are two sides of the same industrial capitalist coin. When I speak of the spread of consumerism, I mean three things. First, I mean the mass production of consumer products such as bicycles and bicycle brands such as those pictured there on the slide. Second, by consumerism, I mean the spread of discourses about products and popular media. Oftentimes, long before people can actually acquire these things for themselves, they start to encounter these things around them in advertising and movies. Seeing these products all around them teaches and taught people to associate consumer products with meanings such as those in the illustrations here. The one on the left there, an advertising for a toothpaste brand in the 1950s. Here, it's telling someone that they can have brighter, whiter teeth and a better smile if they use this particular brand of toothpaste. And note that they're also, of course, teaching people that they need to worry about things such as the quality of their smile and the brightness of their teeth. And then there on the right is a screen grab from a famous film. What is this film teaching? It's teaching inadvertently that having a leather jacket made one fashionable. And third, by consumerism, I mean that people start to create and communicate hierarchical identities through these things, like one person is fashionable and another is not, or such as that people with wristwatches were more sophisticated than their peers who didn't have wristwatches, as these women sent from Shanghai to the countryside may have thought. I found countless anecdotes of people wanting and obtaining these sorts of luxury products in archives, newspapers, interviews, and even internet blogs. And I concluded that the spread of mass-produced things and the desire for them was the demand side of industrial capitalism. Check out this graph here. This shows the proliferation of watch brands across China since 1949. You don't need to be able to see the details to see the increase in watch brands. Even the same brand had many different variations, as with the Shanghai brand watch pictured here. Watch brands and fashions help create hierarchies of products that is critical to consumerism and therefore critical to the continual expansion of demand that drives industrial capitalism. Industrial consumerism made mass products increasingly indispensable for tens of millions of people. A few of the way people used watches beyond telling time include as bribes for officials, as stores of value for farmers after good harvest, and even as rewards for parents to induce their children to study harder for school entrance exams. In many cases, even literal social reproduction, that is the ability of a man to find a wife and have children, depended on his family's ability to obtain one or more of the most desired items. At the time in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, it was a wristwatch, a bicycle, and a sewing machine. Those were the three most sought after things, sometimes also a radio. As China industrialized, of course, the country made more and more consumer goods. There's little to be surprised by that. But what were the implications? I think who gets what, that is, how society distributes what it creates, tells us a lot about a society. Who got the first wristwatch, bicycle, or sewing machine, then the next, the one after that, and so on? And what are the implications of those choices of who got these things first? I concluded that the Chinese Communist Party was not building the egalitarian democratic socialism of its claims. Rather, the Communist Party was building the exact inequalities associated with industrial capitalism. Those inequalities include privileging people who lived in cities over people that lived in the countryside, people that did factory work over farm work, people that worked with their minds, such as managers of those factories, over people that work with their hands, and other forms of inequality, such as favoring men over women or ethnic majorities over minorities. So despite the socialist words, the party's policy deeds prioritize rapid industrialization, capital accumulation at all costs. This unequal and undemocratic distribution reinforced and extended the inequalities of industrial capitalism, and those initial inequalities led to others. So, for instance, somebody who was the first to receive a sewing machine had in effect a labor multiplier that made them more productive and allowed them and their family to gain additional advantages over the people that didn't have these labor multipliers. These inequalities were the direct result of state policies and priorities. Of course, not all capitalism is the same, particularly when it comes to the role of markets versus planning, private versus state ownership of capital, and the role of the state generally. At times, the state aimed to control all three aspects of consumerism. What was mass-produced, the discourses circulating about those mass-produced products, and even the hierarchies of identity that could be communicated through the consumption of these mass-produced products. State control over these three aspects was so extensive that I use the term state consumerism as a correlate of China's state-led capitalism. In other words, state efforts to control consumerism was about freeing up more resources for the production side of capitalism. The efforts to suppress the demand side was so important to the Chinese Communist Party that I think they equated the extracting of endless free labor and the suppression of demand as socialism itself. They did so, for instance, with the famous slogan of the era, which I think captures this ethos of equating socialism with lots of hard work and asking very little in demand. This expression was 艰苦朴素, or work hard and live frugally. Of course, as industrial capitalism expanded in China, the Chinese Communist Party began to shift from suppressing to promoting consumption following the expansionary impulse of industrial capitalism. And once China began to fulfill these first wants, new ones came along, as this slide suggests, to ensure the continual growth of capitalism. So what you see in that slide there is it says it goes around from the 1950s and 60s through the 80s, the 90s, and into the 21st century, talking about what the most desired products were, from things like wristwatches in the 70s to TVs in the 80s, computers in the 90s, all the way up into the 21st century luxury condo. After the Communist Revolution of 1949, the policies of the Chinese Communist Party continued to expand consumerism. The Chinese state developed consumerism in ways that private capital may not have otherwise been able to attempt for decades. It takes, for instance, a lot of resources to set up national chains of stores. Long before private capital in the form of Walmart arrived in China, for instance, the Communist Party policies helped create a network of bookstores and department stores in every province, county, and town. Here are a couple of illustrations of the biggest and most famous department stores in that era. One on the left is in Beijing, and the one on the right is an illustration of inside the Shanghai department store. Unlike the slides, the vast majority of these thousands and thousands of public stores carried only a few products. Nevertheless, the Communist Party began to set up the economies of scale for mass production, distribution, and that critical last part of consumption. We can find in China many or all of the things that we associate with consumerism in market capitalist countries. There were efforts to justify advertising, which the state regulated but never eliminated. And there was a state-sponsored promotion of fashion trends, including this Soviet-inspired fashion trend from the late 1950s. State media promoted this fashion, including in magazines such as the one in the middle of your screen. This one is stamped with the name of a remote town school library, suggesting just how far state consumerism reached and spread new ideas of what one should want and eventually attempt to obtain. In short, both the Communist Party and the standard explanation of calling anything and everything that occurred after 1949 socialist, even the inequalities manifest in advertising and fashion, should be examined a little bit more closely. Here then are 5 reasons why I think we should reconsider the standard framework. First, Why not? The Cold War is over, or so we thought. It seems worthwhile to periodically reconsider our basic concepts, as the Americanists and Western Europeanists have long been doing with the concept and history of capitalism. Second, framing China around the concept of capitalism fits the pieces together in a way that explains previously contradictory evidence, such as why they have all this advertising or fashion trends, or all those forms of inequality I spoke of earlier. I began my research over a decade ago, and I followed the practice in my field by trying to interpret everything and anything that occurred in China in the decades after 1949 as part of this attempt to build socialism. I even thought what I saw at one point was socialist consumerism. But so many things didn't fit into that standard socialist interpretation. And it felt disingenuous for me to evade a core conceptual issue by calling it all socialist consumption. After deciding a capitalist interpretation made better sense of my material, everything began to fit together much more easily. And I felt reassured after finding so many contemporary sources inside and outside China leading us to the same view. As a reminder, there is a 100+ history of interpreting the Soviet Union and other self-proclaimed socialist countries as forms of capitalism. These criticisms provide a very different, and for my material, more convincing way to piece together the history. The capitalist interpretation helps explain parts of China's history since 1949 that contradict this socialist interpretation. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, for instance, China continually reversed and adjusted those institutional arrangements that I spoke of earlier. Sometimes party policies allowed for more markets and more non-state-led consumerism, and other times it suppressed markets and consumption generally. I prefer a history of China since 1949 that includes a wider range of people and evidence, and inconvenient parts of history for the socialist interpretation make more sense when we see Chinese state policies as repeatedly shifting the country back and forth along that spectrum of state to private varieties of capitalism and consumerism. For instance, my approach also addresses a major historiographical and political question. What happened in the years after Mao died in 1976? Did China abandon socialism when it touted market socialism and socialism with Chinese characteristics? Should we maintain the faith that China is still building socialism, though the time frame has shifted from what it said was months away in 1959 of achieving communism to currently centuries away? I think it makes more sense to see China since the late 1970s not as abandoning the communist revolution of 1949 when Deng Xiaoping supported more markets for products and labor. Rather, Deng and his successors simply shifted the institutional arrangements to facilitate an unending expansion of capitalism. Scholars usually giggle at Deng Xiaoping's famous 1982 formulation that's still in use today, that what China is doing is, quote, building socialism with Chinese characteristics. We usually see that phrase as a thinly veiled justification for what David Harvey called privatization with Chinese characteristics. But I think we should similarly question earlier attempts by the Chinese state to call anything and everything building socialism. Likewise, trade friction between China and the US today isn't because China is socialist, but because it's a very different variety of capitalism, a more state-led variety. Third, the old communism versus capitalism binary focuses on what states and political elites, on both sides of the Cold War, wanted people to think. When we look closer, we find people had doubts over what the Communist Party was building. So the sources led me to my interpretation. I found people at all levels of Chinese society who picked up on the contradiction between socialist words of egalitarianism and capitalist policies leading to more and more inequalities. We can debate the meaning and use of the concepts of capitalism and socialism in the present, but I also want to know what people thought at the time. The standard interpretation of China often assumes that people thought whatever the Communist Party was up to was socialism. State sources insist on it. Sure, of course, some of the beneficiaries of state policies likely thought so, such as those who got the first wristwatches or those who worked as the labor aristocracy in state factories, then the best jobs. But I found it easy to find pervasive doubts that led me to doubt the standard explanation. Uncovering such doubts helps counter the assumption of the standard interpretation that Chinese people on the street thought they were building socialism. Sometimes the actions of people conveyed doubts. Workers who went on strikes in factories or who conserved their labor power when they were working in those state factories only to sell it at private factories later. And we also find the usual weapons of the highly exploited rural weak, who hid, ate, and stole grain. All of these actions expressed doubts. Other times, those doubts were explicit, such as when Mao Zedong told the famous American journalist Edgar Snow in 1965 that the children are, quote, negating the communist revolution and restoring capitalism. Mao's use of that term, incidentally, negating, is why I felt comfortable using it in my subtitle as well. In 1963 and 1964, the Chinese Communist Party disseminated across the country and all around the world lengthy criticisms of the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union had been the model of a socialist state. But by the early 1960s, Chinese leaders had begun to criticize the Soviet Union, not as a model, but as a cautionary tale of a socialist country gone bad, a socialist country that had, quote, restored capitalism. These commentaries accused the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, of being a, quote, phony communist and leading the Soviet Union to what the Chinese Communist Party called a, quote, capitalist restoration. Nearly everything these criticisms identified as the telltale signs of a capitalist restoration going on in the Soviet Union, however, were also occurring in China at that same time. China also had at that same time massive amounts of gray market activity, widespread corruption, providing some government workers with lavish lifestyles, and even the reemergence of local labor markets. So with these criticisms of the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party was effectively providing its own population with a vocabulary to criticize what was going on around them. In doing so, of course, the Communist Party also helped create doubts over whether they were in fact building socialism. By interpreting the history of China since 1949 around building socialism, in my view, historians are not uncovering and honoring the lived realities or ontology of ordinary people who thought, gee, this is what socialism is. Rather, I think we are squeezing their experiences into an interpretive box, a box constructed by the states and the powerful. Because adherents to the China was socialism seldom address such doubts, they also seldom examine how the Chinese Communist Party's created good reasons for people to have these doubts in the first place. Fourth, expanding our understanding of industrial capitalism to include these state-led varieties at that other end of the spectrum fits with newer understandings of capitalism. Here's how. Very little of China in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s looked anything like what we might think of as capitalism or consumerism. However, capitalism always varies, yet one aspect remains constant. Capitalism always requires fresh, free inputs, an environment to raid without consequence, unpaid care work done inside homes, mostly by women and girls, racial exploitation, enslaved peoples in the colonies to produce a more orthodox variety of capitalism in the metropole, trillions of dollars in state bailouts, and of course, new places within a country and abroad to incorporate. Global capitalism forces China to prioritize growth over everything and sacrifice any dreams of a democratic workers' socialist paradise. These global pressures help create the state-led and non-market features of latecomers to industrial capitalism. So to me, shifts in the institutional arrangements of Chinese capitalism, shifts that have included more or less direct state involvement in markets and ownership, have been part of inter-capitalist rivalries among countries right down to the present. broadening our understanding of capitalism allows us to discern these non-traditional aspects that were part of industrial capitalism. I focus on the other half of capitalism, the half that is so often assumed to always be there, demand and consumption. And I think that you can see the unfolding of these inequalities associated with industrial capitalism much more readily from this angle rather than, say, focusing primarily on how commodified were products or labor during these times. Fifth and finally, the climate crisis. We know that the endless expansion of capitalism or growthism is killing our biosphere. Good history already includes the analytical categories of race, gender, class, and ethnicity, but contemporary history now should include the climate crisis and its existential threat to humanity. To understand the problem of addressing the climate crisis, we must understand capitalism and its prioritization of growth over human needs. I don't think it helps to understand our world to exoticize an inner capitalist rivalry by framing China since 1949 as a grand but failed or ongoing attempt to replace capitalism with socialism. Rather, we may learn more about how to reform or replace capitalism and save our biosphere by focusing on the growth imperative that lies at the heart of all forms of capitalism, then and now. Thanks for your time and interest. I look forward to our discussion.